The fear arrives, unannounced, unseen. I know it's here. I feel the weight of the shadow it casts over me. Its servants, specters and apparitions that haunt my mind, anxiety, loneliness, depression, rage. In a chorus of voices, they seek to drown me out, keep me silent with anguish and paralyzed in the darkness. But somewhere, a small still voice whispers, "Don't give up just yet. Keep walking. Lift your head up, and hope will show you the way."
Well, good morning. I said last week that January comes from this Latin word meaning door. So January is this door to new beginnings. But I've been thinking about how if I listen to all of the new beginnings, all of the voices, the January voices that tell me what I should and shouldn't be doing, it feels less like a door to new beginnings and more like a series of hurdles that I need to jump to get into the year. Is anybody else kind of with me on that? Like now, I watch what's going on, and now it's like January is now like vegan January. So apparently you're supposed to give up meat during January. Is everybody else picked up on this? Like you think that's bad, there's another thing called dry January. Can you make jokes about that in church? Is that okay? Or is that just like too far? It's like the deepest fears is we have a Scottish pastor. He probably has issues. Then there's like gym January where you're supposed to go to the gym every day. I've got friends doing run every day January. I thought that was bad, but they also did run every day December. So, and then on top of all of this, there's kind of, giving up meat, being dry, going to the gym all the time. Then there's all these New Year's resolutions, aren't there? Like, I'm going to be more present this year. I'm going to be more in touch with people. I'm going to consciously be less drawn in by my email, by my social media, by my technology in general. And we try and do all of these things, and we're trying to get it all together. And then Netflix goes and launches a show about the KonMari method. Marie Kondo is an organizational consultant. Yep, that's a real thing. And this is a TV show, quite literally, about tidying up. I think we've hit peak privilege now in the Western world. What else can we watch? Well, we've done all the zombie movies. Let's have a movie about tidying up. In fact, let's make a whole show about tidying up. According to Marie, basically her method says that a clean house equals a clean mind. And all tidying problems can be solved with a simple question. Does this spark me joy? Now, I have to admit, I really like this, right? Because I'm naturally a pretty messy person, and I thought, okay, this is quite fascinating. This is quite interesting, because I'm conflicted. I'm naturally messy, but I like tidy, right? But then she said this. She said, you don't need to have I'm struggling with this one, okay? She said, you don't need to have more than 30 books. So I was like, get behind me, Satan, and your demons. And then I realized she means in your car, right? So I'm back on board with her method once again. But perhaps there's an important point, though, in Marie's sort of theory and the way that she goes around things. And the point seems to be that the chaos of our lives can become the chaos of our minds. Or sometimes the other way around, that a chaotic mind becomes a chaotic life. And we're trying to keep control of things, but life is becoming more and more busy. Life is becoming more and more stressful. And ultimately, this all becomes anxiety-inducing. There's this pressure on us to live this sort of Insta-worthy life, to have, a family that looks Instagram postable, to have a house that looks like it should be on Facebook and everybody should look at it and feel jealous. And the irony is, we know that everything we see on social media is fake, basically. It's just a very brief snapshot of what somebody chooses to show us, and yet it still affects us. We still try and live up to it, and we find ourselves constantly stressed and anxious about the kind of life that we're supposed to be living and what it's supposed to look like. In this teaching series, we're journeying with Job. And Job, if you've been reading along with us as we've been sort of charting our way through this book, Job is a character who is suffused with anxiety. Job's world is unstable. Job is afraid. He's afraid of many things, including God. Job plays by the rules. He keeps it safe. Job worries about making mistakes. Job is permanently uneasy. We see this in chapter 1, where Job finds himself involved in his sort of ritual purification traditions that he would normally do. And when he's doing them, he offers sacrifices to atone for his children, saying, perhaps my children have sinned. And then the text shows us that it's not just that perhaps my children have sinned, perhaps my children have just had bad thoughts. I should do something just in case. Job's like an ancient Marie Kondo. He's tidying and cleaning and decluttering and trying to make sure everything's just the way it should be. But as we listen and we hear Job begin to talk in chapter 3 of this great poem in the Bible, we get a sense of the anxiety that Job is living with. He says this, "My worst fears have happened. My nightmares have come to life. Silence and peace have abandoned me, and anguish camps in my heart." Deep within the core of Job's skull, at the top of his spinal column, was a pair of almond-sized nuclei called the amygdalae. All of his experiences, everything Job ever saw, smelled, heard, touched, felt, or thought, passed through this amygdalae like travelers passing through airport security. And there, in this part of his brain, every single experience he ever had is instantly and automatically screened for its threat to him. See, because at the core of all of our minds is a desire to feel safe. It's the desire to feel like we're going to be okay. If we don't feel safe, if we perceive a threat, our brain's survival systems kick in, that fight or flight agenda that tells us how should we go about dealing with this particular threat. Now, this is a good thing. This is how we get to live to our old age, by carefully and properly assessing threats. The problem is this part of our brain can get a little jumpy sometimes. It can get a little overreactive. Because perhaps your brain encounters something that it's not been programmed to deal with. It's not been programmed to recognize it's something new. And your brain has to guess at how should I respond to this particular new thing. Is it or is it not a threat? Now, for those of us who struggle with anxiety, that journey perhaps a journey not dissimilar to Job's, our brains tend to guess towards threat more often than not. What eventually starts to happen is everything starts to get treated like a threat. Everything starts to get imagined for its possible danger towards us. And this becomes exhausting. No matter how smart you are, Jennifer Shannon says, no matter how crystal clear your vision, everything is distorted when viewed through the lens of fear. Now, those of us who suffer with anxiety invariably find our minds get hijacked with two particular ways of thinking. Firstly, we have a tendency towards overestimating the threat of what it is that we're afraid of happening. So we perceive something, we perceive it as a threat, and that in itself may actually be faulty perception to begin with, but then we overestimate the danger that this threat particularly shows. The second thing that then happens is very, very common amongst people who struggle with their anxieties is that they then underestimate the ability to deal with that perceived threat. Now think about the tension that creates in a person's life. An overestimation of a threat and an underestimation of your ability to cope with that threat. So we imagine something really bad is going to happen and then assume that will have far more destructive qualities than it would actually have. So as a result, the sufferer finds themselves essentially with their life on pause. The ever-present anxiety leaves them paralyzed. People with anxiety can spend days reviewing the past for all of the errors and mistakes in it and being paranoid about the future because of all of the threats that might happen there. This is why if you are close to someone who has anxiety, if you journey alongside someone with anxiety, if you have anxiety yourself, you'll know that tiredness and a feeling of being overwhelmed are pretty regular bedfellows. That they're with us all the time, that sense of just being exhausted with everything that the brain has to process. The three voices in particular seem to go on in the minds of people when they struggle with anxiety. I want to just put them on screen so we can kind of name them. The three voices essentially are this: the intolerance of uncertainty. I must be 100% certain about what's going on. A perfectionism that says, I cannot and I must not make mistakes. And then an over-responsibility that kind of believes that I am responsible for everybody's happiness and safety. Someone wrestling with deep senses of anxiety will often hear themselves thinking, like, as long as I'm certain, as long as I'm perfect, as long as everybody else is okay, then I'll be safe, then I'll be able to relax, and then I'll be happy. This appears to be Job's life as he scurries around trying to clean and tidy and keep everything in order and everything in its right place. He realizes that ultimately this is an impossible task. It's an unrelenting standard to try and live with, and it's driven by anxiety. The thing is, this sort of anxiety doesn't just affect the person that suffers with it. It leaks. Anxiety like this leaks into those who are close to you. Anxiety like this leaks into your husband or your wife, your son or your daughter, your friends, your other family members, the people you work with. Because this anxiety becomes infectious as you try and eradicate all uncertainty, as you try and make everything perfect, and you take responsibility for things that you cannot possibly be responsible for. This has huge impact on you and those around you. But the way our world is going, the way we're choosing to try and live in the West, means that this is more and more common, this level of anxiety that comes from a desire of control. I saw a report just recently talking about the rise of child YouTube stars. Children who are making videos, teenagers who are making videos, and they appear in YouTube channels, and they become successful, and they become famous in that sort of context and world, and then the drive to continue being famous, to seek the likes that will meet you at the top of the polls of popularity. This is happening to our children, and this report was showing that more and more child YouTube stars are confessing their struggles with anxiety, with burnout, and with other mental health problems. Our children, pursuing fame and success by our world standard, find themselves hurt, find themselves in pain, and find themselves suffering. I think the unnerving thing about a lot of this is that I would hasten a guess, and it is just a guess, but many of us would get uncomfortable as we see those three voices on screen just a moment ago. As we look through thoughts about over-responsibility, leanings towards perfectionism, the desire to have everything just be certain, perhaps there's a slight uncomfort in our seat because while these things are becoming more and more common in society, there's still a deep-rooted perception in many of us that challenges to do with our own thinking and our own mental health are things that happen to other people. There's a definite sense of a them and us in this. And we want to be the us. We don't want to be the them. We don't want to often have to confess that maybe I'm them. And part of the problem is because how we talk about the them, how we talk about the people that suffer, are in pain, or wrestle with their mental health, is we talk about it in very distant language. But increasingly, there's a realization amongst the people that study this sort of thing that actually we live on a continuum. It's not as clear as there's people who struggle with this and people who don't, but it's probably more on a continuum where we find ourselves at different places on a line. Yet still we persist in thinking about them and us, about people who struggle and ourselves. And you see this in the story of Job. You see Job as he's heading into these horrendous tragedies in his life, and everything starts falling apart. All of a sudden, Job's friends turn up. And we always say friends slightly loosely when we're talking about Job's friends. In chapter 4, Eliphaz the Temanite turns up. He says this to Job: "Have you lost all faith in your piety? all hope in your perfect conduct? Can an innocent man be punished? Can a good man die in distress? You are lucky God has scolded you, so take his lesson to heart. Like, this is a really religious way of saying, I think this is your fault, Job. Like, most of us, and think about Job's friends, they don't like seeing Job suffer. Most of us don't like seeing our friends in pain. And oftentimes we structure our social relationships around preventing and alleviating suffering. But sometimes trying to fix everything, trying to find a solution, trying to get to the core of what is it that's wrong here isn't actually that helpful. If we really want to help our family and our friends, perhaps we need to make sure that we're not like Job's friends. Perhaps we need to stop presuming that we can fix everything. You may imagine that you know better. You may think, well, if you just did this and did that and did the next thing, everything would sort its way out. But do we really understand a person's journey? Do we really know what they're going through that has brought them to the place that they presently are? Do they want our advice? And in regards to Eliphaz's question, whoever said following God was going to make your life easier? What about his other friend? Bildad turns up. Bildad the Shuhite. Now, there is a joke from ancient times about Bildad being the smallest person in the Bible, like Shuhite, but I wouldn't probably tell that joke in church. Your children must have been evil, Bildad says. He punished them for their crimes. Now, there's a sentence to give someone who's just lost their family. Well, maybe it's their fault. Maybe you just had terrible kids. There's like really, really dark, horrible sort of language. But it strikes me, and you see this a lot during the story of Job, that let's call it like this. Pseudo-experts love finding out the reasons for why things have gone wrong. They come along and they say, hey, this is what's up here. We can put a name to this. We can put a reason to this. We can figure this out and make sure you don't make that mistake again. But it's a pseudo-expertise. We're not talking about actual experts, but these friends that turn up. And maybe these friends are motivated by a thought that is, I just hope this doesn't happen to me. Or maybe it's their own anxieties that's driving them. But their expertise is false. And church has been particularly bad at this over the years. Churches have been full of pseudo-experts offering out opinions on why something's happened or why something's going on in a person's life. And oftentimes, the reason we might call it pseudo-expertise is because the root of the expertise misunderstands God, misunderstands the God of the Bible. Your children must have been evil, Bildad says. Well, this is to completely misunderstand how God works. You probably read any page at random in the life of Jesus, you kind of find yourself thinking, no, this is not how God works. But it sounds believable in the context. Maybe these guys know more than me, says Job. Maybe these guys are more aware of what's actually going on in the world. And so we find ourselves often surrounded by, let's just call it a pseudo-spirituality, an idea that somehow presents itself in a kind of superiority. We find people in Christian communities sort of presenting themselves in such a way that says, I understand how your situation's working, and I'm now going to tell you how to put it right. But Job is a fascinating book for us to read in that particular context. As you read towards the end, you realize that God doesn't take too kindly to the so-called experts that are Job's friends. Eugene Peterson perhaps says it best when he frames it like this: sufferers attract fixers the way that roadkill attracts vultures. More often than not, these people use the word of God frequently and loosely. They're full of spiritual diagnosis and prescription. It all sounds so hopeful, but then we begin to wonder, why is it that for all their apparent compassion, we feel worse instead of better after they've said their piece? As a pastor, I find myself throughout my ministry, to be honest with you, hearing a little too much about expert Christians that can solve other people's problems, that can name the spiritual condition that they're particularly suffering from. And I've heard so much of it across the years in various different contexts that I've worked in. People that say, oh, this is a spiritual war that you're in, this is a curse that's been placed upon you, this is some force of evil, or even something demonic that's threatening you, or it's your sins, or it's your lack of faith. And let me say this really clearly. Like, I believe that stuff. I believe that stuff because it's in the Bible. We see these things being unpacked in the Bible. But I'm also a Christian. And that means that I believe that Jesus has fundamentally overcome these things. Jesus' followers have been reborn in Christ. So if we read our New Testaments rather than the latest bestseller on the Christian shelves, what we actually find so often is a Jesus who absolutely overcomes the things that would threaten us. And too often there's a sort of language that bounces around local church that sort of suggests, well, if you could just achieve this better level of spirituality, that would improve and avoid all of the problems that you're currently suffering from. But sometimes we've got to listen to our kids in kids' church, where they learn these very simple verses from Romans, such as, nothing shall separate you from the love of God. And we've got to work that stuff into our deepest theology and realize that Jesus is protecting us and pulling us together. So when we find people rolling out their so-called theory as to why you're in the particular problem you're in, always be careful to think about whether it sounds like Job's friends or not. Whether it sounds like this kind of pseudo-expertise that might send you chasing some solution that is already with you in Jesus. And then Job has another friend turn up, Zophar the Naamathite. These guys are great names, right? I'm just throwing them out there for anyone that's pregnant and might be coming up short. You say, Zophar says, you say, my conscience is clear. You think that your life is spotless. But if God were to cross-examine you and turn up your hidden motives and presented his case against you and told you why he has punished you, you would know that your guilt is great. I mean, who needs enemies with friends like these? There's something wrong with you, Job. Job, you're a faker. Job, you're an imposter. Job, you're not doing anything right. You're just pretending. But when I read Job, the most terrifying thing that occurs to me is that most of the things that Job's friends accuse him of, most of the things that Job's friends suggest to him, most of their theories, Job has already considered himself. He's already wondered, is this what's wrong with me? Because for so many of us, there's kind of like a tape playing on loop in our minds that's telling us, yeah, you're a bit of a fake. You're an imposter. You're not enough. Everybody knows that you're a fake. They're just waiting for that moment to come true. Many of us find on a day-to-day basis the sense of, how long am I here for? And when will it be that people realize I don't know what I'm doing? Writers often talk about the blinking cursor. Every writer I've ever met describes the same terror, actually, at various points. A blank white screen with a black blinking line on it called a cursor. And it's called a cursor for a reason. What do you have to say? What have you got worth writing about? Who do you think you are, thinking that you can say something that anyone will want to read? And this is at the basis of what we call imposter syndrome, this deep fear that we have that we're just faking it. When I was writing my doctoral dissertation, I lived in that. I was pretty convinced that people were only being nice to me because no one was brave enough to warn me of the inevitable spectacular failure that was coming my direction. So when I gave a presentation and people said it was good, I thought, they're just not brave enough to tell me the truth. So my supervisor was English, right? So we're really low on superlatives. I handed him a 40,000-word piece once, and he held it in his hands. He said, this is good. And I found out later that's a really big compliment in England. But even then, I wasn't too sure about it. And I was always threatened by this blinking line flashing on the screen. My wife would go out to work, and she'd come back, and she'd say, did you have a good day writing? And I'd say, yes. And some days that meant I'd written like one sentence. And like one day I was particularly proud of, she came to me and said, how was your day? I said, I wrote a whole footnote today. What a footnote it was. I mean, that's a real high point in my life that I just have marked for the ages. Other days I'd get up and delete the sentence that I'd written the day before. But the perceptions of other people's view of me, the perception of other people's success can be so destabilizing for me and probably for you as well. How do I think other people are doing? Why does it feel like I'm struggling with this, but everybody else has got it all together. And we kind of wrestle with that a lot, don't we? I mean, how do you feel right now when I'm sat here waving around a doctoral dissertation saying, oh, this was hard work. By the way, this is just a lot of blank paper that I stuck together just to illustrate a point, really. That we perceive what we think we know is going on, and then we judge ourselves accordingly. I wonder if this is why our lives are so unhappy sometimes today, because we have this constant social media feed of showing us how much everybody else has got it together. But it's the perception of others. It's how we think we're perceived. And often the perception we have of others is just what we are seeing and what they choose to show us. But it leaves us in this place with this constant question, this sort of repeating question that goes round and round in our minds constantly. In Scotland, we phrase the question like this: am I enough, or amn't I? Amn't in Scotland is the negative of the verb am. We also have other helpful negatives, like the opposite of the verb are is arnie. And I'd love you to try and use this in a sentence at some point this week, just to try and affect my Scottish influence. It's part to do with how we get a visa to leave the country. But I was deeply disturbed, and my father was over with us over New Year, and I realized that he has a lot of words that my increasingly Canadian daughter doesn't know. So I'm on a new mission now to introduce Scottish language to us. So if you could use the word amn't in a sentence this week, I'd really appreciate it. But am I enough, or amn't I enough? The anxiety around this sets our life so often in concrete and saps all of our energies because we just don't know. Am I good enough? Do I have it all together? Why am I in this particular place? Surely I'm faking it. Absolutely, I must be an imposter. Because for reasons that I'm not entirely sure of, we as humans choose to calibrate ourselves against others. We use other humans to judge our perceptions of who we are. The problem is, our perceptions of who we are is based on what others choose to show us. It's based on what they've put as their best foot forward. And so we allow our life to be calibrated against a very small part of other people's lives. Rob Bell says it like this: there will always be someone who's smarter than you. There will always be someone with more raw talent than you. There will always be someone more experienced, better qualified, harder working, stronger and more articulate and more creative, with more stamina, who can sing better than you can. But who you aren't isn't interesting. And then, in the story of Job, another voice appears. The unnameable answers Job from within the whirlwind. We've heard the voices of Job's own head. We hear the voices of friends and how they speak into Job's situation. But what will God say? How will God's voice affect this discourse? And God starts big. Where were you when I planned the earth? Tell me if you are so wise. Do you know its dimensions, measuring its length with a cord? I mean, you got to say, this conversation doesn't start well for Job. Like you know when you're in it, you've got an argument and you're going to go, I'm going to go and see my boss and I'm going to tell him this and I'm going to tell him that and I'm going to sort this out. And you walk in and he says something and you're like, that's a really good point. And now my whole argument feels really weak. You know, God opens up with Job. Hey, Job, where were you when I made the world? Right? So it gets worse. He goes, have you ever commanded morning or guided dawn to its place, to hold the corners of the sky and shake off the last few stars? Have you ever seen where the snow is stored? I know the answer to this one: Alberta. Or have you visited the storehouse of hail? If you shout, that's the Hebrew, if you shout commands to the thunderclouds, will they rush off to do your bidding? And then God starts to bring it down a little closer to home for Job, maybe trying to give him a bit of a chance. Is the wild ox willing to serve you? Will he spend the night in your stable? Who unties the wild ass and lets him wander at will? This is the early first draft of the famous song, Who Let the Dogs Out? Can you see what Can you see what God is doing to Job? You guys seem to think that was funnier than I thought it was. I don't know. Can you see what God is doing to Job? Like at first glance, it appears like he's belittling him. It appears like God is going like, seriously, what on earth are you doing talking to me? But all of Job's anxieties appear to come from the three things. As long as I am certain, as long as I am perfect, and as long as others are okay, I'll be safe, able to relax, and happy. Job's anxiety comes out of this desire to control everything. If I can hold everything together. Because so often anxiety is a desire not to let anything in your life be out of control. And God comes before Job and points out to him, Job, you're not in control. When you actually want to try and be in control, you're going to very quickly realize you can't be in control of the things that you want to be in control of. If you can't even be in control of the ox, what chance have you got with dawn or hail or snow or the earth's dimensions? God seems to be saying to Job, Job, don't try and play my part of the game. You're not going to be able to, and it's just going to destroy you if you try. And then God takes a turn in the conversation and rolls out a piece of theological genius on Job by beginning to talk about ostriches, which is always a surprise in a theological conversation. Like you're having some deep kind of conversation about philosophy and meaning and existentialism, and then God starts talking about ostriches. But to me, this is one of the most profound and beautiful moments of Scripture. It's one of my favorite moments of Scripture, is God's conversation with Job about ostriches. Do you deck the ostrich with wings, with elegant plumes and feathers, says God? She lays her eggs in the dirt and lets them hatch on the ground, forgetting that a foot may crush them or sharp teeth crack them open. She treats her children cruelly, as if they were not her own. For God deprived her of wisdom, and he left her with little sense. God says to Job, you ever considered ostriches? Like, that is one seriously dumb bird. Like, as far as birds go, it's really dumb. And birds generally, they aren't the smartest of things, but this is like a really dumb one. This is even more dumb than the regular dumb ones. It's also, like, worse than that, it's a really bad parent, like terrible parent. Like, look, it's terrible, and it has wings, but it can't fly. Like, this is a failure of a bird. If the ostrich plays the comparison game on parenting, or flying, or brains generally, the ostrich is not going to do well. It's going to conclude, I amn't enough. But that's not why God built ostriches. God says to Job, when she spreads her wings to run, she laughs at the horse and rider. See, because you're always comparing ostriches to other birds. You're always saying, how does this stack up as a bird? And God comes to Job and says, but that's not right. You don't compare ostriches to birds, you compare ostriches to horses. Right? Ostriches are built for speed. That a horse and rider, the fastest thing known in the ancient world, is laughed at by the ostrich. Albert Einstein said once that everybody's a genius. But if you judge a fish by its ability to ride a bicycle, it'll live its whole life thinking that it's stupid. If you judge an ostrich against other birds, it's always going to come up inferior. But that's not why God made ostriches, Job. Human anxiety is deeply rooted. We know that. And we know that it's not easily fixable. Sometimes it may not even be fixable in this life for some of us. But it's important for us to realize that God doesn't judge the ostrich against other birds. And that means that you are enough for Jesus, even if you're not sure whether you're enough. Because for us, like Job, the question ultimately is one about which voice you want to listen to. The voice in your head that asks all of the questions about control and what's going on. Or the voices of those around us who try and find blame and try and attach pseudo reasons or try and suggest that we might be imposters. Or do we listen to the voice in the whirlwind? Who does God say that you are. And when we forget that, we start trying to take over control ourselves again, and we begin on our way down a journey that will ultimately push us to the very brink of our energies. The band are just going to sing for us just now, and I'd love for you just to take a moment and just reflect. What are the voices that you're listening to? What are the voices that are challenging in your life? Where are your anxieties coming from? Is there a journey for you to think through what do you need to release? What do you need to open your hands to and say, God, I got to give you that control back? Or perhaps you know the people that you're trying to fix. And just as we sing, rather as the band sing to us, I'd love to just invite you to take a moment and think about where you sit in the lives of others that might need your help, but not necessarily your fixing. In 1 Peter in chapter 5, Peter says this, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. And that's the story of Job's anxiety. It's about control. It's about trust. And the question is, can he let go? It's like God's question to Job is, Job, you who doesn't hold the world together, you can choose to try and keep control of it, or you can release that grip. Just let it out of your fingers a little bit and give it to the one who does control everything, because that one also cares for you. Let me pray for you this morning. I encourage you just to continue reading through Job with us. Follow the plan on the app or on Facebook, and allow that story just to sort of seep into your life and hear God's voice throughout it. As pastors, we're always here to pray for you, so if you need us after the service, we're down here at the front, or get in touch with us through the week. But let me just pray for all of us this morning in a really simple way, where we say, may you for whom the anxiety makes it impossible to relax because you're searching for certainty, perfection, control. May you this morning be able just to loosen your grip a little bit, just to let go of all those cares that you hold tight and cast that anxiety onto Jesus, the Jesus who loves you, who thinks you are enough, who is the voice that you should listen to, because he is the Jesus who cares for you. And may his grace and peace be with you. Amen and amen. God bless you.